Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side is often seen as a tragic culmination of events that transpired in Revenge of the Sith. However, one could argue that his turn began much sooner than the infamous duel on Mustafar, or even the revelation of Darth Sidious's true identity. The seeds of his downfall were planted early, and subtle shifts in his character, decisions, and relationships reveal that Anakin's turn to the dark side happened much earlier than most realize. Anakin was a product of unique circumstances, a slave boy discovered on Tatooine with unparalleled force potential. Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi who believed in him, introduced Anakin to the Jedi Order under unusual conditions, foretelling his importance as the prophesied chosen one who would bring balance to the Force. Yet, it is important to note that Anakin's introduction to the Jedi Order was rife with unease. From the moment he stood before the Jedi Council on Coruscant, it was clear that he did not fit their mold. His fear, rooted in his attachment to his mother, set him apart from the other Jedi, who were trained from infancy to sever such emotional ties. The Council's initial rejection of him and later reluctant acceptance ensured that Anakin would always feel like an outsider within the Order. This sense of alienation only deepened over time. Anakin was deeply emotional, a quality that directly clashed with the Jedi teachings of detachment and suppression of personal feelings. This clash created a schism within him, forcing him to navigate his identity as both a powerful Jedi and a man burdened with personal struggles and attachments. His bond with his mother, which was severed when he left Tatooine, remained an unresolved source of anguish. The death of his mother, Shmi Skywalker, at the hands of Tusken Raiders was a pivotal moment in Anakin's journey. In his grief, he slaughtered the entire Tusken camp, men, women, and children, an act driven by hatred and vengeance. This massacre was a clear violation of Jedi principles, yet it marked only the beginning of Anakin's descent into darkness. Anakin's relationship with Padme Amidala further complicated his precarious position. His deep love for her, concealed from the Jedi Order due to their strict prohibitions against attachment, became a significant factor in his eventual turn. What's often overlooked, however, is how this relationship subtly shifted his perspective long before Palpatine actively began manipulating him. Anakin saw the Jedi Code as an obstacle rather than a guiding principle. His willingness to deceive the Council about his marriage demonstrated that his allegiance to Padme superseded his loyalty to the Jedi Order. This prioritization of personal desires over duty was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern in Anakin's decision-making. The Clone Wars only accelerated Anakin's internal conflict. As a general in the Republic's army, he was thrust into a role that demanded decisive, sometimes ruthless, action. The war eroded many of the Jedi's values, forcing them into positions where pragmatism often outweighed their ideals. For Anakin, this period was particularly transformative. His experiences on the battlefield normalized violence and desensitized him to the suffering of others. His growing friendship with Chancellor Palpatine during this time was also significant. Palpatine played the long game, subtly nurturing Anakin's doubts about the Jedi and feeding his frustrations with the Order. Anakin, who already felt misunderstood and undervalued by the Jedi, found in Palpatine a mentor who validated his feelings and ambitions. Palpatine's influence on Anakin is often cited as the primary catalyst for his fall, but the groundwork had been laid long before. Anakin's moral compromises, such as his actions on Tatooine and his willingness to employ questionable tactics during the Clone Wars, demonstrate that his transformation was gradual. Palpatine merely exploited vulnerabilities that already existed. The Jedi Council's distrust of Anakin further fueled his resentment. Despite his considerable contributions to the war effort, they remained wary of his unorthodox methods and emotional volatility. Their decision to withhold the rank of Master when Anakin was appointed to the Council was a particularly egregious blow to his ego, reinforcing his belief that the Jedi undervalued and mistrusted him. The cracks in Anakin's loyalty to the Jedi became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. By the time he learned of Padme's pregnancy, he was already teetering on the edge. His vision of her death during childbirth, coupled with his inability to protect his mother, reignited his deepest fears of loss and failure. These fears became a driving force behind his actions, making him susceptible to Palpatine's manipulations. Palpatine's promise of power to save Padme resonated with Anakin's desperate need for control. However, it's crucial to recognize that Anakin's willingness to embrace such promises stemmed from a pattern of defiance and distrust that had been building for years. His eventual betrayal of Mace Windu in alignment with Palpatine was not a sudden change of heart, but the culmination of a long journey toward the dark side. While the events of Revenge of the Sith are often framed as the moment Anakin became Darth Vader, the truth is that his transformation began much earlier. By the time he pledged himself to Sidious, he had already compromised many of the values that defined him as a Jedi. His actions during the Clone Wars, his personal vendettas, and his disregard for the Jedi Code all pointed to a gradual erosion of his moral foundation. The tragedy of Anakin Skywalker is not that he turned to the dark side, but that his fall was almost inevitable. The circumstances of his life, his relationships, and the pressures he faced created a perfect storm that made his descent all but certain. The Jedi's failure to address Anakin's unique needs and struggles played a significant role in his downfall. Rather than providing him with the guidance and support he needed, they dismissed his concerns and imposed rigid expectations that only deepened his sense of isolation. This mismanagement allowed Palpatine to position himself as a confidant and mentor, further driving a wedge between Anakin and the Jedi. In the end, Anakin's turn to the dark side was not a single decision, but the result of years of internal conflict, external pressures, and missed opportunities for intervention. Anakin's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring warning signs and the importance of understanding and addressing individual needs. His fall to the dark side was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual process that began long before he took the name Darth Vader. By examining his journey in its entirety, we can see that Anakin's turn happened much earlier than we often think, long before the events of Revenge of the Sith unfolded. It was a process rooted in fear, anger, and the inability of those around him to recognize and address his struggles, ultimately leading to one of the most tragic downfalls in galactic history. Anakin Skywalker's descent into the dark side, while formally solidified during the events of Revenge of the Sith, had its roots embedded in the complex interplay of personal insecurities, systemic failures within the Jedi Order, and the manipulations of external forces long before his allegiance shifted. To fully grasp the depth of his early fall, one must dissect the intricacies of his relationships, the pressures of the Clone Wars, and the role of the galaxy's shifting political landscape. The Jedi Order's rigidity and lack of adaptability were among the key factors that contributed to Anakin's early disillusionment. The Jedi prided themselves on emotional detachment, seeing it as a cornerstone of maintaining balance within themselves and the Force. However, this approach was inherently flawed when applied to someone like Anakin, whose existence defied conventional Jedi norms. Unlike most Jedi who were inducted into the Order as infants, Anakin joined at a later age, already burdened with attachments, most notably to his mother. The trauma of leaving her behind on Tatooine was never adequately addressed, leaving him with a lingering sense of guilt and fear of loss. The Jedi, rather than acknowledging and helping him process these emotions, merely demanded that he suppress them. This systemic inflexibility extended into Anakin's later years as a Jedi Knight. His profound connection to Padme Amidala, forged during their shared trials in Attack of the Clones and later deepened through their secret marriage, created a dual life that further alienated him from the Order. Anakin's love for Padme, while pure in intent, was marred by his possessiveness and fear of losing her. These emotions stood in direct opposition to the Jedi teachings, which considered attachment a pathway to the dark side. Yet, Anakin's secret love wasn't the issue itself, it was the Jedi's inability to reconcile their own humanity with their principles that pushed him into further isolation. By rejecting the possibility of compassion and connection, the Order inadvertently set the stage for Anakin to seek emotional validation elsewhere. And that elsewhere was, of course, Palpatine. The Chancellor's role in Anakin's downfall cannot be overstated, but it is critical to understand how his influence operated as both a catalyst and a mirror to Anakin's pre-existing fractures. Palpatine recognized in Anakin a volatile mix of power, ambition, and insecurity. Unlike the Jedi, who saw these traits as liabilities, Palpatine framed them as strengths, validating Anakin's belief in his exceptionalism. Throughout the Clone Wars, Palpatine subtly fed Anakin's frustrations with the Jedi, portraying them as narrow-minded, overly bureaucratic, and distrustful of his abilities. The Jedi's decision to place Anakin on the council without granting him the rank of master, an unprecedented move, only reinforced these suspicions. Anakin viewed it as a deliberate slight, not just against his abilities but against his very identity. Palpatine also exploited Anakin's personal traumas. The death of Anakin Skywalker, which drove Anakin to commit his first overtly dark act, the slaughter of the Tusken Raider village, was a pivotal moment that revealed his capacity for violence driven by emotion. Palpatine knew that Anakin's fear of loss was his greatest weakness and used it to sow seeds of doubt about the Jedi's capacity to protect the people he loved. By the time Anakin began having visions of Padmé's death in childbirth, he was already primed to believe that the Jedi were incapable of preventing such a fate. Palpatine's promise of the dark side as a means to save her was the logical endpoint of years of manipulation. The Clone Wars further complicated Anakin's relationship with the Jedi and the Republic. While the Jedi were supposed to be peacekeepers, their role as generals in a galactic war forced them to compromise their ideals. For Anakin, the war normalized the use of extreme measures, and his successes on the battlefield often came through strategies that walked the line between pragmatism and ruthlessness. The war also amplified his disillusionment with the Jedi Order, as he saw them becoming increasingly embroiled in political machinations that seemed to betray their spiritual mission. Anakin, already struggling with his faith in the Jedi Code, began to see the Order as hypocritical and out of touch, a sentiment that Palpatine eagerly reinforced. Beyond Anakin's personal journey, the broader socio-political context of the galaxy cannot be ignored. The Republic's transformation into the Empire was not solely a result of Palpatine's scheming, but also a reflection of widespread discontent and systemic corruption. Anakin, as a central figure in this transition, was caught in the crossfire of conflicting loyalties. He believed in the ideals of the Republic, but was disillusioned by its failures. Similarly, he revered the Jedi's principles but grew resentful of their dogmatic rigidity. These tensions made him susceptible to Palpatine's vision of a new order, one that promised stability, security, and, most importantly, the power to protect the people he loved. One of the most telling moments of Anakin's early alignment with the dark side occurred during the Clone Wars, when he executed Count Dooku at Palpatine's behest. In that moment, Anakin abandoned the Jedi Code, killing a defenseless opponent out of revenge rather than justice. While he initially expressed regret, the act marked a significant step toward his eventual transformation. Palpatine's praise of his decision further muddled Anakin's moral compass, blurring the line between what was acceptable under the Jedi Code and what was necessary for the greater good. Anakin's internal struggles were mirrored in his external actions, often revealing his growing reliance on aggression and dominance to achieve his goals. His interactions with Padmé and Obi-Wan Kenobi highlight this shift. While Padmé remained a grounding force for much of Anakin's journey, his possessiveness and inability to trust her completely foreshadowed his eventual turn. His relationship with Obi-Wan, once characterized by camaraderie and mutual respect, became increasingly strained as Anakin grew more resentful of Obi-Wan's adherence to Jedi principles and his perceived role as an enforcer of the Council's will. By the time Anakin officially pledged himself to Darth Sidious and took the name Darth Vader, his transformation was less a sudden shift and more the culmination of years of conflict, compromise, and manipulation. His slaughter of the Jedi at the Temple and his subsequent attack on the Separatist leaders on Mustafar were not isolated acts of betrayal but the natural progression of a mindset that had been brewing since his youth. Anakin's fall was not the result of a single moment of weakness but a series of choices, each one pulling him further away from the light. Ultimately, Anakin's turn to the dark side can be traced back to the very foundations of his character and circumstances. His journey was shaped by a series of systemic failures: the Jedi's inability to adapt to his unique needs, the Republic's descent into chaos, and the galaxy's inability to reconcile ideals with reality. Palpatine's role, while critical, was merely the spark that ignited a fire that had been smoldering for years. Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader long before he donned the mask. The tragedy is that no one around him recognized it in time to stop it.